Good afternoon and welcome back to the Lord's European Affairs Committee. We are pursuing our inquiry into the UK-EU reset of relations. I'm delighted to welcome a number of new members of our committee who've joined for the first time today. Lord Frost, Lord Whitty, Baroness Winterton, and unfortunately Baroness Sutty can't be with us today, but they are our four new members. And also a very warm welcome to our three witnesses. We have in the room with us, we have Anton Spisak, who is the Associate Fellow at the Centre for European Reform and former official in the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office. Online, we have Shanker Singham, the Chairman and CEO of Competere Limited, I hope I pronounced that right, former advisor in the Department of International Trade, and Philip Rycroft, former Permanent Secretary in the Department for Exiting the EU. So everyone very welcome indeed. We shall have a transcript after this, which we'll of course send you, and that will take an hour or possibly a bit longer if you have that time available. There's a lot of ground to cover. I would ask you to kick off perhaps fairly briefly. The other thing I should perhaps say is that you don't all feel you have to answer each question. You can select questions, and if you don't particularly want to intervene, very happy that you should pass to give more time to others. So my opening question to all three of you, I think, is what do you think the government should seek to achieve, given that they've decided to go for this reset? What would you regard as a successful outcome from this reset? So shall I start online? Shall I start with Philip, perhaps, and then come to Anton and then to Shanker?
Yeah, good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Committee. Thank you very much for inviting me along this afternoon. It's an interesting and important question. I think it's just worth going back to basics briefly. The EU-UK relationship is a fundamentally important one. The EU is still our major trading partner. Our defence and security interests are clearly absolutely linked into the European continent. There's a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since 2016. We're facing substantial disruption to the global trading order. We have a hot war and a revanchist power on Europe's borders, and very unpredictable policy making now in the US. So the interest of the UK in the EU in facing those issues remain very much, to my mind, still aligned. So it seems that any sensible government in the UK would be looking to achieve a good, stable and productive relationship with the EU. The question of how far this government seeks to take that relationship is indeed an interesting one. It has been keener, perhaps early days still, but it's been keener perhaps hitherto to stress its red lines, what it won't do, go back into the single market and the customs union, than it has been to outline what it sees as the long-term future relationship with the EU. That is a very big question. I'm not sure that this government will get to that anytime soon. I personally believe that requires a quite deep national conversation. I'm not sure we're ready as a nation, indeed, to have that conversation. So what we will see over the next little while, I think, will be of a relatively curtailed ambition. It will be useful and important, but it will not presage a fundamental change in the relationship that we have. As I say, there will be progress, hopefully, but we'll see how far that goes. I think just one final thought, Chair, the notion of a reset, I think, can be slightly misleading. In that it implies that we'll go from state A to state B and that's it. In fact, this relationship, as it's always been, will be a relationship which evolves and changes over time. So what happens over the next year or two will not be the end of the story by any means. It will be part of that continuum of evolution over the longer term.
Thank you very much. I think we said in our call for evidence this is a moving target, as you say. Mrs. Spisak, do you want to pick up from there?
Thank you very much for having me today. I would say an initial goal of the reset was definitely to inject more stability and more confidence and trust into this relationship, which has been really hindered by low trust in the last couple of years. But it has, and this goal in many ways has been achieved by the government. I think all the initial steps the government decided to take in the last 6 months, with the Prime Minister going to the European Council dinner last night, with the Foreign Secretary deciding to establish a new foreign policy dialogue, with the decision to set up a new political summit between EU leadership and Prime Minister, are all constructive steps that really, I think, have helped improve the political climate between the European Union and the UK government in those last 6 months. I think the real question is what will happen now with the reset. Are the two sides ready and prepared to translate some of that improvement in the political climate into more concrete commitments and more concrete policy commitments? And I do think there is a real window of opportunity now between this moment, between last night and the 19th of May, when the new summit is going to take place, where the two sides should really step up and explore a number of strategic interests that they have in common. One of those is to discuss in very concrete terms how they can step up cooperation on security and defense in light of a change of policy in the US administration, I think, and the new risks that are coming from Washington, D.C. I think second, they should really explore new economic security risks, which are something that have really emerged in the last couple of years. And lastly, they should also try to put the relationship on a more stable footing with a number of measures that can be taken to stabilize some of the aspects of the trade and cooperation agreement and deepen cooperation. And I'm sure we can get into details of all these different aspects in later discussion.
We definitely tease all those out in questions, I think. Yep. Mr. Singham, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee. I want to focus more on the economic relationship between the UK and the EU, and I think here what I think the government needs to be guided by is, first of all, not to view the relationship with the EU in isolation. It's part of a whole set of relationships the UK has around the world, and it needs to be viewed in that light. In that context, I think there are a couple of sort of key constraints or sort of operating principles, if you will. One is the maintenance of the UK's independent trade policy. And the second is the maintenance of the UK's domestic regulatory autonomy so that it can improve its regulatory environment. Both of those are the areas where you can find economic growth and GDP per capita gains. Subject to those constraints, I would suggest to the government that a good outcome here on the economic partnership is to do everything possible to have as good a relationship, trading relationship with the EU as you can get without violating those constraints. And actually within that, there is quite a lot that you can do. So, and I'm sure we can get into this later on, but there's certainly a lot you can do with regard to the improvement of the TCA. There are areas of the TCA like services that could be improved. There are areas of the TCA with regard to mutual recognition of goods that could be improved. There's a lot of unilateral things the UK could do to improve the flow of imports into the UK, and it's important to remember that imports are as important as exports from the UK to the EU. Our exports rely on raw material imports and so forth. So you have to view both of those things together. We can improve UK border control measures. And there are many things that the EU is advancing on, particularly things like its customs reform, its trust and check, its trusted trader schemes, where it is possible for the UK and the EU to have a better set of relationships. Obviously, and I'm sure we'll get into this as well, there are certain aspects of the relationship regarding Northern Ireland that I think could be improved. We have the Windsor Framework coming in full implementation at the end of March, but I think there are things that can be improved. And I think we have to also recognise, the UK has to also recognise the very much changed environment in the last month with in the new US administration. And in that context, that some of the things that we might have thought were settled are changing. So, for example, the EU's regulatory system itself is changing and is a moving target.
Yeah.
So we have to be conscious of that triangular relationship between the US, EU, and the UK, and our sort of role in that. But happy to explore all of those things in greater detail later on, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. I think the one area we probably won't dive deeply into is Northern Ireland, because we now have a Northern Ireland committee which is going to be taking the lead on that. We've got so much on our plate in this inquiry. But thank you very much indeed. I think we're well launched. Lord Jackson.
Thank you, Chairman. May I ask, what is your assessment of the government's reset policy so far, and is it being ambitious enough? And is there merit to the criticism that it's not moving fast enough and it's got unclear objectives? And if I may, Chair, having read the very interesting article by Mr. Spisak on the reset, in it he, I think, partly posits a binary choice between the US and the EU. What specifically had you in mind when you wrote that?
Thank you very much for that question. I mean, on the first part of the question, on the general approach the government has taken to the reset, I would say the initial focus on confidence building was the right one, rather than moving straight into the negotiations. I think there was always a risk that the European Commission could just dismiss any ideas for improvements as being unrealistic at that stage, but also given the electoral cycle within the EU itself, EU institutions were in flux in the second half of last year, and it was difficult to engage on substance. So I do think now is the time to engage on substance, and my article suggests a number of areas where this could be done, including on security and defense through a new security and defense partnership, which as an initial step, I think could be a non-binding declaration, but could be then built into a more formal set of arrangements. And then on economic security, which at the moment is, I do think, underdeveloped area of the relationship that does deserve a greater attention. On the second half of the question, and this is where we'll get into all these really interesting dynamic which is now emerging between the US, the EU and the UK. I think it's fair to say there is a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability coming from Washington, D.C. We just saw in the last couple of days the decision of President Trump to impose tariffs on some of the closest allies of the United States, but then also to suspend those tariffs or at least pause them for the time being. But I do think, depending on what will come from the US, it will create an interesting dilemma for the Labour government, and I don't think it's inconceivable that the Trump administration might try to pull the UK away from the EU that it sees as being an outdated institution, overly bureaucratic, and create a set of incentives for the UK government to come closer on the economic agenda to the agenda of the US administration. And then, of course, a lot would depend on the detail of that offer. I know that there are some ideas floating around Washington, D.C. about potentially offering accession for the United Kingdom to the USMCA deal, which will be up for renegotiation next year. And there are ideas about extending membership of that arrangement to other countries, not only Mexico and Canada. That would be, in many ways, a game changer, I think, for the UK government in thinking about how to construct post-Brexit trading relationships. Again, a lot depends on the policy specifics of what that would entail. But if that were to happen, that would create a very significant point of divergence between the approach that the government is taking towards the European Union and potentially to the US. I would, caveat all of this by saying that we just don't know at this point, but I think it will be a really interesting time to be thinking about the set of strategic interests that the UK has, and that we have together as the Western Economic Alliance, not only with the US but also with the European Union and other partners.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Do we have either of the other witnesses want to comment on Lord Jackson's question?
I would just say one thing on the choice that we may or may not have. I tend to agree actually with the Prime Minister that it is not a choice between the US and the EU, and I think the government should be wary of being put in a position of making false choices. I think there is a choice to be made, and it is a choice I think that's perhaps different from what many people think is the choice. I think there is a view that you've got these three big regulatory blocks. You've got the US, the EU, and China, and we've got to make a sort of choice as a third country sort of between them. I don't think we do. I think the choice is between two sort of operating systems. I mean, one is an operating system based on mutual recognition and equivalence and adequacy and those kinds of things. Which is the relationship we currently have under the TCA with the EU, which could be expanded and deepened in terms of mutual recognition and so forth. I think that's the kind of agreement the US will probably put before the UK. It may well be some sort of USMCA accession. I think it's more likely to be a bilateral offer agreement that is going to be heavily based on the text of the USMCA, possibly even simply the text of the USMCA as amended, because Trump is in the process of using tariffs with Canada and Mexico to probably renegotiate the USMCA. I think where we are going to be challenged and where there will be difficulty is the rules of origin of that USMCA offer from the US will be very, very tight. They will be very illiberal. And so the question then becomes, what does the UK do in response to that? And I think that's why I've recommended, and our Trade Facilitation Commission that's headed up by your colleague Lord Agnew has recommended that the UK join the Pan-European, the PEM Convention. Which is essentially a rule of origin convention which allows you to accumulate across your European and North African supply chains. And I see no problem doing that and doing a USMCA with quite restrictive rules of origin. In fact, in some ways, that combination could drive manufacturing into the UK, which would not be a bad outcome. So I think there isn't a choice between the EU and the US here. I think there is a are you going to follow the regulatory mutual recognition kind of approach with regulatory competition and recognition, or are you going to choose some sort of alignment to EU rules? And I think alignment to EU rules prevents you from improving your own regulatory system. It damages your independent trade policy. It doesn't, I think, achieve very much in terms of the paperwork that would still be required because you're outside the customs union and internal market. And so I think the better choice is to follow the TCA and trade agreement model, which we also are part of through the CPTPP. And I'll close by just saying that the CPTPP itself, which we've obviously already signed up to, when President Trump in the first Trump administration pulled the US out of the TPP, he simultaneously renegotiated the NAFTA agreement into the USMCA by, in large measure, porting over a number of the chapters from the TPP. So we've actually signed a lot of the chapters that would be in the US offer already, which puts the UK in, I think, quite a strong position for this sort of process going forward.
Thank you very much indeed. A lot of issues there. We have a separate session next week, actually digging even deeper into the trade issues, but thank you so much for that. Lord Stirrup.
Chair, thank you very much. I'd like to probe further on this issue of red lines, and I'd like to take it in three parts, if I may. First of all, will there be UK red lines? I mean, it seems clear from what the government has said that there will. The issue of non-membership of the single market and the customs union seems fairly clear-cut. But on free movement of people, that's perhaps a little more nebulous. So, I mean, has the government left itself any wiggle room in that particular area, particularly for young people? Then the second dimension of the question is, should there be red lines? For example, on security and defence, in a recently published article which Mr. Spisak co-authored, it said that the EU needs to move beyond conventional frameworks and recognise the UK as a strategic partner rather than an ordinary third country. Well, yes, but this committee has heard evidence that that is extremely unlikely. Should that be a red line for the UK? That if it is to participate in these things, it must be a strategic partner, given that there are many other non-specific EU routes for such cooperation. What about fishing for sand eels? Should that be a red line on environmental issues? And thirdly, the third dimension of the question is, what is the likely impact of any of these red lines on the actual negotiation process itself?
I think we should perhaps give Mr. Rycroft a first shot at that. It's always a risk of being online that you're always the third. Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot wrapped up in that. The big red lines are clear, as you've intimated, not going back into the single market, the customs union. I think that just reflects the political reality of where we're at. Whether that should pertain in the long term is a debate for another day. I sort of wrapped up in that. I think the question you ask about freedom of movement, particularly in respect of youth mobility, that's a really interesting question. Personal view, but I think the government has made a big strategic mistake by seeming to equate youth mobility with freedom of movement. So if it does concede on youth mobility now, there'll be lots out there saying that it's bending to the will of the EU, and this is a precursor to going back to freedom of movement, which of course it's not. It's time limited, visa driven, it's reciprocal. And in my view, a very good thing, and not just for youngsters in the EU, but for youngsters in the UK as well. And it is a big ask for the EU, and I would hope that the government responds to that sensibly in terms of achieving some of its other goals. I think trying to set out other red lines at this stage, the sand deals, I have rather a lot of empathy for the sand deals personally, so I'd hope that does become a red line for the sake of the puffins and the other seabirds. But more seriously, I think that this is going to be a complex multi-part negotiation. As I said earlier on, it's not going to conclude in May this year. It is effectively a continual negotiation now from here on forever, just much as the Swiss have found over the last few decades. So the government needs to be very careful, it seems to me, about spraying red lines around at this stage. It should be canny and agile in its negotiating strategy. It's just worth, I think, saying that we have to be cognizant also of where the other side's coming from. I think when Lord Jackson was asking about ambition, of course, the UK should be ambitious, but that ambition has to be framed in what is going to be or likely to be achievable from the EU perspective. And the EU, as we know, is a tough negotiator. It negotiates in its own interests. The TCA, because of its emphasis on goods and because of the surplus in trade that the EU has with the UK on goods, works pretty well for the EU. So it's not going to be in a huge rush to improve it just because the UK is asking. So as Anton has described it, building up that trust over time, being seen as good neighbours, building particularly on the defence and security, I think personally that's the most fruitful line to take. All of that over time will build up, it seems to me, a context where we may get more out of the EU, them recognising that our asks ultimately are good for them as well. But we need to be a little bit wary of the red lines, and I think the government has made a misstep, particularly on the youth mobility thing, by making that seem like a red line, which at some point is going to have to step over.
Mr. Spisak.
I do think there is quite a bit of room for maneuver within those red lines. I don't think those red lines are as set in stone as they may seem. For example, just to give you a thought experiment, the EU has just concluded its agreement with Switzerland, something that it's been negotiating for many years. In that agreement, which I think is hugely significant for the UK-EU reset, by the way, but we can get onto that in a minute. It agreed to essentially allow Swiss product standards to be recognized as equivalent to the EU's product standards across a range of categories. It also agreed a common food safety area based on harmonization with EU law. That harmonization is not based on traditional dynamic alignment as we know it from the EU system itself. It's based on a similar system to the one that is part of the Northern Ireland arrangement, the Windsor Framework. It also doesn't include a direct jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice. It includes a role for the independent arbitration panel with an option to refer those questions to the European Court of Justice where matters of EU law are involved. Would this fall under the government's red line of not seeking membership of the EU single market or not? That's a question for the government to ask. In my view, it wouldn't, because we are not talking about formal membership of the single market. But clearly it would be a very substantial improvement on the status quo, and it would be a very substantial change in the nature of that trading relationship that would put the UK much closer, and it would partially integrate the UK into the single market for goods only, not for services. So that's just a little thought experiment for you all and for the government to think about in light of this change that has happened on the EU side in the last couple of months. I think what I would say in terms of the EU's interests in all of this, if I may, is the European Commission has gone through a process of formulating its own interests in the last couple of months. And I don't think there is anything surprising in that list of interests. On the offensive side, they talk about improving trade in energy, about updating the fisheries arrangements that are due for renewal in June 2026 in any case. They also include things like improving mobility arrangements for young people and so on. So none of that is new to the UK side, and it has been on the table for quite some time. On the defensive side, again, they emphasize the need to protect the integrity of the single market, a phrase that has been talked about a lot in the last couple of years, and to avoid selective participation in the single market itself, which would seem to preclude an arrangement like the one that the Commission has just concluded with the Swiss. But at the same time, that precedent has now been set by the Commission and by the same team of negotiators who are, by the way, leading also on the UK relationship. So I think all of this is adding a new dynamic into this negotiation, and one that is hugely consequential for the reset.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at the time, we probably better move on. Lord Frost, and welcome again to the committee.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. Government has, as far as we can tell anyway, identified 3 priority negotiating objectives for the trade and mobility area, though it does slightly depend which day you ask them, I think. But as far as we could tell, the 3 areas were an SPS agreement, help for touring artists, and MRPQ, mutual recognition of qualifications. What do you think, how much difference do you think these things are going to make to the economic relationship and the trade with the EU, if any? Maybe this is one for Shanker to start off with.
Sure.
Perhaps.
Thank you very much, Lord Frost. I mean, I think if you, going back to answer your question, going back to the red lines, I would say that you sort of got to get behind the customs union and the single market and understand why those are red lines. And I think the only 2 economic red lines would be, for me, that independent trade policy and domestic regulatory autonomy. And you'd look at everything through that lens. So if you look at the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, for example, through that lens, you would say, well, it doesn't harm your trade policy, it doesn't affect your domestic regulatory autonomy, and therefore it's something that you would want to do. I think also, to echo what Philip said about the youth mobility scheme, I think these are the sorts of things that can be done, will be good for both the EU and the UK economies, and don't implicate those red lines. On the other hand, an SPS agreement would have to be looked at very carefully, because if it's along the model of the sort of New Zealand EU mutual recognition agreement, the EU New Zealand veterinary agreement, which is a mutual recognition agreement, which does allow different regulatory specific regulations, as long as the ultimate outcome is objectively the same, which is the WTO kind of standard, then I would see no concern there. On the other hand, something that leads you towards either dynamic alignment or harmonization or something like that does have an effect on your regulatory autonomy. And if I can just say something about why the regulatory piece is so important, because I think this is sometimes sort of lost in the discussion. I think businesses recognize there are sort of three regulatory costs. Businesses recognize two of them generally. One is compliance costs, and nobody wants to comply with burdensome regulation, and obviously you want your regulatory system to be as least burdensome as possible. There's also the cost of divergence, which is a very operative thing in the context of the UK and the EU diverging. But the biggest regulatory cost of all is the cost of regulation that has a damaging effect on competition. And our economic models and studies, and my growth commission's models, have suggested that actually that cost is even 3 to 4 times bigger than your traditional trade barrier at the border costs. So if you are, so it very much depends on what system of regulation you are aligning to. If you were aligning to something that's very pro-competitive, then that cost would be very small, and your divergence cost would be the most important thing. If you're aligning to something that is very anti-competitive, then your divergence cost is much smaller, and you would want to do something different. So I think in the current context, the EU itself recognizes that its regulatory system is damaging to competition. Various organizations have shown the cost of this, 3% of EU GDP per capita. We have the Draghi report and so on. So, if that changes, if the European regulatory system changes, then that may be starting with regard to the sort of if impact of the US administration and what they're doing, then we might want to revisit this at some point in the future. But at the moment, I think your regulatory autonomy is very important. Simply having it is not enough, though. I mean, you have to actually do something with it. You have to actually, improve your regulatory system in general. Continue to do that.
Who else would like to follow that up?
Happy to come in. I think the three areas identified are important in their own right, clearly, not economic game shifters. I think of the three of them, the SPS deal would probably have the biggest potential impact. Just to touch on them very briefly, the touring musicians, and this is just part of the sort of joy of life, isn't it? The ability to get artists, creative folk round about the place without the sort of hassles they face at the moment. Not hugely economically important, but symbolically, I think, useful to have. I know that the EU's been jibbed at it. I hope they would change their mind on that. MRPQ is interesting that the services side of the UK economy is actually doing pretty well in terms of exports, particularly the sort of the unregulated services. So MRPQ might be useful for legal, financial services, perhaps architects and so on, but for some of the services that are doing really pretty well in terms of consultancy, computer IT side of things and so on, perhaps not that relevant, so useful and a good thing to have if we can get it, but will be hard fought because there will be a lot of concern about the competitive threat to the provider of services in individual member states. The SPS one, I think, is the most interesting, the most economically significant. If we could do something to relieve the burdens that UK exporters are facing in the food and drink sphere, that would be great. Let's not forget we've got a sort of form of unilateral disarmament at the moment with this, where the UK border is still not to memory fully functioning, but UK exporters have faced those burdens pretty much from day one. And, you know, there's stories over the weekend about cheese exporters and the number of processes they have to go through now, which they never had to do before. I think the point that Shanker makes absolutely fundamental on this. What is the resolution of this? Is it some sort of mutual recognition, or is it dynamic alignment? I think that's going to be the really tough negotiating question that the government will face. Let's not forget on dynamic alignment, that requires the UK Parliament to be following the twists and turns in SPS law coming out of the EU pretty much on a day-to-day basis, huge volume of legislation, difficult and controversial. So if there's a mutual recognition route available, the government should push hard for that. Just one final quick point on this. New Zealand, it's about 1-2%, I think, of EU food trade. The UK is closer to 10%, and we're physically a lot closer as well. So whether or not the EU would accept the sort of New Zealand deal for the UK, that I think is a big issue. But that's going to be hard negotiating yards for the UK to get an outcome that does allow for that mutual recognition rather than dynamic alignment.
We move on at that point. We can always come back to these issues as we go through it. Duke of Wellington.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, following on from that incredibly interesting series of answers, the government has stated, as Lord Frost said, that they are seeking agreements on such things as SPS, touring artists and mutual recognition of professional qualifications. What, in the opinion of the three of you, might be other areas of the economic relationship which the government ought to try to negotiate? Perhaps I could ask Mr. Rycroft that initially.
Thank you. I'll come back very briefly because both Anton and Shanker, I'm sure, will have views on this. I think there are, as both Shanker and Anton have said, there's other areas that the government could go, could look at. It will be about assessing a little bit where the ambition of the EU lies. What is the negotiating art of the possible? One area, and I do declare an interest here as a non-executive director of the UK Accreditation Service, but one overarching area which picks up Shanker's theme of mutual recognition is mutual recognition of conformity assessment. It's basically saying we trust your accreditation body to ensure that your conformity assessment bodies do their work well, and therefore if they say that a product conforms to an appropriate standard, we believe that assessment. What this would do would be to avoid companies, UK companies having, and indeed EU companies having to do the evaluation of a product twice, one for the UK market, one's for the EU market. It's that sort of thing which is scalable, which doesn't require dynamic alignment, which is in the interests of EU firms as well as UK firms. A bit technical, a bit behind the scenes, not that exciting, but really important for economic dynamism and for trade between the two parties. It's the sort of thing that I hope the government would start to put a bit of negotiating oomph into. And it's you as you extend out from that step by step, not frightening the horses, not seeking to sort of seem to be getting into the single market through a back door. That's where I think the productive approach would take. But this will only unroll over time. You're not going to get there in one bound.
And as others respond, could I just ask whether you have any thoughts on another area that's been in the press recently, aligning with the emissions trading system and the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Are those also valuable things that the government should be looking at? Duke of Wellington, should we go to Mr. Spisak next, perhaps?
No, I would say, just going back to the initial question of Lord Frost, I do think the three areas that the government identified are important, but equally I do worry that they are relatively marginal in the broader context of the UK relationship, and also they seem to mask a certain lack of strategic vision for the overall relationship. And the broader question of how Europe fits into the government's strategy for growth, trades and industrial policy. And I do think if I were to prioritize areas that should be guide to Europe's strategy for the next couple of years, I think I would pick three. One is improving trade in goods, which I think is enormously important in light of what has happened to UK trade and economic performance since the pandemic. And I say since the pandemic because it's difficult to disentangle the effects of the pandemic and Brexit. But what we do know, what has happened to UK trade openness, is very striking and very concerning based on the latest figures since the last quarter of 2019. Just before the pandemic, UK trade openness fell by 6%. Whilst at the same time, if we compare this to G7 countries, and I'm using G7 average, at the same time it grew by 7%. So that's a 14 percentage point difference in terms of what has happened to UK trade in that period of the last 5 years. This is driven by a fall in goods trade almost exclusively, because services trade has held up in this time, which is really remarkable, by the way, and deserves a whole different discussion. But I think there's a very serious problem on the goods side, which relates not only to trade with the European Union but also with non-European countries. But the UK really is an outlier when it comes to this trade performance relative to other similar economies. And I do think I'm surprised this fall of trade openness is not linked to the growth story we told about what has happened to the UK economy in the last couple of years, because it seems to me that a relative decline in trade openness seems to be a real drag on UK growth, at least in the short term, and it should deserve a far greater focus in the government's growth strategy than it has been to date. If this is the reality that we are facing, then I do think the government should be using the reset to really come as close as possible to the single market in goods. It should explore, as Philip has suggested, mutual recognition arrangements for product standards across a range of areas. It should also explore, I do think, an SPS agreement, which, in my view, given the small percentage of agri-food trade as overall trade with the EU is actually very small, and the relative loss of regulatory autonomy would be quite small, I think, in my view, in exchange for quite a big gain in terms of the reduction of regulatory burdens, but this is my personal view. Then that's one area that the government should explore. And then lastly, there is clearly a space to explore something closer on energy trade, where there remains a number of issues that have been left unresolved in the TCA, including trading of electricity. But B, the question of the linkage of the emission trading systems is enormously important, not only in its own right, but also in light of the application of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's coming into effect quite soon, and would potentially see new tariffs on British exporters into the EU. And I do think there is a merit in linking the ETS. And again, there are precedents. For example, the Swiss have a sort of associate membership of the ETS. They essentially aligned to it in domestic law, but they are not formally part of the emission trading system. So I think there are some interesting precedents to explore there, and it should be a priority for the government to look at those.
Did Mr. Singham want to add? I'm going to play my chairman's role of saying we probably need to accelerate a little bit if we're going to get through in a reasonable time, but I don't want to prevent Mr. Singham commenting as well.
Yes, I can do it fairly quickly. In terms of other things that the UK can do beyond what we talked about, I mentioned before the PEM Convention. I think that would be useful for accumulation of supply chains, which would have some effect. There's no silver bullet. You need to do lots of different things. I agree with Philip that mutual recognition of conformity assessment and also market surveillance is important. But I would go further, and I would use the precedent of the best mutual recognition agreement, which is really the Australia, New Zealand agreement and the Trans-Tasman Mutual Recognition Agreement, which is not only conformity assessment and market surveillance, but also underlying product market regulation, which is the sort of holy grail of mutual recognition. You should ask for these things. You may not get them, but you should certainly ask for these things. I think also in terms of other things we can do, there's quite a lot we can do unilaterally. We have unilaterally recognized medicines approvals from the US, EU, and Japan. In other words, an approval from one of those regulatory agencies you can put a product on the market in the UK without having to get a UK regulatory approval. These kinds of things, this kind of unilateral recognition, you could also do in the SPS area, because there is the UK has a trade deficit with the EU on SPS goods. We import a lot more than we export, and so making those imports easier through a sort of unilateral recognition of SPS would also allow you to simplify your import border controls, because you would only really be requiring importers to prove that the goods were EU origin. So I think there's quite a lot there that could be done. That would, each of these things gives you a little bit of a benefit, and you add up all of these benefits, and you start to get a significant contribution to growth. I mean, in terms of SPS and alignment agreements, I think the problem with this is that it cuts your trade policy and your regulatory autonomy, because there's the one area where EU regulation is probably the most restrictive is the SPS area, and therefore it is the area that most of our trading partners want to see progress on. And I think what the US is doing is the administration has basically issued an injunction through executive order to all the agencies to look at unfair trade practices in foreign countries. That will be the basis of their tariff policy going forward after April. And SPS will certainly be right in the crosshairs. So I think we have to do what we can on SPS that does not implicate, our ability to do things like gene editing and all of these other things that would be tremendously beneficial for our agricultural sector. So those are some of the things I think that we could certainly advance on immediately.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a pretty extensive list from the three of you for us to get our teeth into. Baroness Hayter.
I should avoid commenting, but let's say my former committee, the International Agreements Committee, perhaps wasn't quite as pleased with the New Zealand-Australia agreement on mutual recognition as being suggested. But my question really was about, and to some extent some bits have been covered already, but just in case there's anything more you want to add about how the government can actually best join up its two main thrusts at the moment. One is the EU reset, and the other is its growth objective, and how the EU reset can sit with the growth objective, which obviously includes also foreign direct investment and other things, and also how the EU reset sits with its wider international objectives, whether that's over solidarity or development or human rights or trade, the other things that it's getting up to.
Would like to kick off on that? Mr. Spisak.
Perhaps I can just expand on some of the points I was making earlier. So I do think it's really important to link trade openness and the fall of trade openness in the last couple of years with the whole growth agenda, because that to me seems to be one crucial missing part of the government strategy at present. But equally, I think we are in a really difficult time internationally, where some of the geopolitical and geoeconomic forces are going to make it far more difficult to trade freely, including with our closest partners and allies that would have been traditionally the US and the EU, and we are seeing a real rise in protectionist measures across the board. The UK, again, is a little bit of an outlier in not really formulating its economic security strategy to date, even though a lot of other Western countries, including the United States, the EU, Japan, South Korea, have all laid down a set of principles guiding economic security in this time and age. So I do think more clarity on getting on economic security strategy that the government is using would be helpful. But here also I think closer coordination with the European Union on things like trade defense instruments, export controls, foreign direct investment, would be all beneficial, because at present those are the things that are largely unaddressed in the relationship. But getting people in the same room to discuss these things on a regular basis and building a regular cadence of meetings, especially at this moment in time when quite a lot is happening internationally, would really help. So I do think, you know, in the big picture, there is a bit of a tension between trying to do these things and the kind of global headwinds that the government will be facing. But I think it will be really important to link all these things into coherent strategy. And ultimately, the effectiveness of any strategy does not depend on whether it is written in a polished document, drafted in somewhere in Whitehall, but it really depends on whether there is shared understanding across cabinet and government on the set of priorities. And I think linking growth, trade, and Europe should be one of them.
Does either of our online witnesses like to comment further?
Could I
Only if you need
come
to.
in briefly? Clearly, growth absolutely has to be the priority for this government or any government. You look at productivity growth over time. The UK been trundling along very low productivity growth, hence the problem in the money raised for public services and so on. But what's always been the case is that the things you need to do to drive growth in the UK economy, most of it was always tangential to our obligations coming from the EU, stuff like planning, infrastructure investment, research and development, skills, all of this emerging out of a domestic policy context, and the government rightly focusing on that. And clearly the access to the EU market was important in that space in terms of opportunities for trade and so on. But the main drivers of growth, domestic policy. I think the issue now, the linkage between that growth agenda and the broader international agenda, not just the reset relations with the EU, but beyond, it is about confidence for businesses, it's about stability, it's about regulatory certainty, it's about the attractiveness of the UK as a destination for investment. And as everybody's pointing out, this is a really difficult road that the government's going to have to walk now, because it's going to have to box very cleverly between its relationship with the EU and its relationship with the US. It is one of the consequences of coming out of the EU. The UK is no longer part of one of the big three trade blocs in the world, and there is a risk that we get ground small between them. So the government will come back to what we were discussing earlier on, will be very, very loath, rightly so, to have to make a choice between those trade blocs, and let's hope it's not forced to do so. But in my view, what it should be doing all the time is thinking about the steps that it takes. What does this do to generate confidence in the UK as a place to do business? Because that is fundamental, ultimately, to its growth agenda.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass on to Baroness Ainley, please.
Thank you. This afternoon rather, we've heard very clear evidence about the complexity of the issues that are part of the reset negotiations. I'd like to look now at the machinery of government that is providing for the UK those negotiators and that negotiating stance, and ask our witnesses, what do they consider the challenges of managing any negotiation with the EU that spans multiple departments of government and policy areas, including both, of course, devolved and reserved ones? And how would you assess any progress the government has made so far? Perhaps Philip Rycroft might want to start.
You asked very big questions today. I mean, that's another huge question. And clearly has been a long history, as you'll be aware, of the management of EU matters within the UK government. As it was, I was the last joint chair of the interface between what was once UCREP and the Cabinet Office, the last manifestation of that, the Rycroft Barrow meeting as part of the sort of coordination mechanisms in Whitehall. Basically, in my view, the government Whitehall's going to have to find its way back into that sort of space. How do you coordinate effectively? And theme running through everything we've been discussing today is the way that EU issues permeate into so much of policy thinking in a UK context. I think, just to cut to the chase on this, I think it's very sensible that the responsibility for that coordination has been brought back into the Cabinet Office from the FCDO. The Foreign Office was never, begging your pardon, Chair, but I think never had that sort of capability to delve deep into the many nooks and crannies of industrial economic policy that EU issues required, and that remains the case today. And the other thing that underpins this is that the Cabinet Office is one of the three centres of government that has clout over the rest. So re-establishing something along the lines of the old European and Global Issues Secretariat, I think, is the right thing to do. And that will hopefully power up the government on this. Just one caveat on that. The UK has always struggled a bit to develop the right sort of expertise on European issues within Whitehall and indeed the devolved governments. That will not have got any easier over the next little while, and it's going to have to work very hard, it seems to me, to ensure that it grows that expertise and incentivises that expertise within Whitehall. Just very briefly, you mentioned the relationship with the devolved governments, and the whole Brexit saga, of course, was not kind to the sustaining of this union. There's a long, sorry story there, which I will not go through today. But the long and short of it, as a government coming in seeking to reset not just relations with the EU, but also to some extent with the devolved governments, has to utilise the mechanisms, the way that it's reframed intergovernmental relations, which is the subject of a big inquiry by one of your colleague committees, Constitutional Committee. It has to infuse those new structures with a spirit of collaboration, cooperation with the devolved governments to ensure that their views are taken into account on a day-to-day basis. Let's make no bones about it. This is not easy for Whitehall to do. It is difficult. It takes time. It requires trusting the devolved governments, and that trust is not always there. But it is critical if you want people in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland to believe that their interests are being advanced as the UK thinks through its future relationship with the EU. That sort of understanding, that trust, of course, was seriously damaged in the case of Scotland and Northern Ireland by the whole Brexit process, given the way those parts of the UK voted. So this is fundamentally important and a really important challenge for the government to pick up.
Challenging remarks there about the Foreign Office in view of the fact that two former officials of the Foreign Office on this committee, but thank you. Again, bearing in mind time, does anybody have any additional sort of urgent points to make on that?
Yeah, I just had one quick. Follow-up on that. I think one of the challenges in the past has been, and it's totally natural how it's occurred, but nevertheless, has been a problem, which is the bifurcation and the sort of siloing of the EU negotiation policy from sort of rest of world negotiation, and in particular, US now is critical. That's a real tectonic shift, and I think in terms of machinery government, you want to have a single mind over all of this, because if the goal is, and the critical growth mission of the government is, how do you increase household income? How do you increase UK GDP per capita? You can't ignore these other forces coming from the US and indeed China. I do think there are certain things that if you were to have that kind of negotiating apparatus, and it may be that belongs in the Cabinet Office, but wherever it does belong, it needs to be a single mind. Because one of the things that we're going to be under a lot of pressure, both the UK and the EU from the US, is what is our policy on China. And that's where what Anton was talking about in terms of trade defense measures, that there's quite a lot that certainly the US, UK, and EU could agree in terms of an overall approach on China. And that is going to be probably, in terms of trade, the biggest single issue that's coming at us. And I think also, Chair, you mentioned CBAM previously. I think we have to look at European member states that are pushing back on a lot of the EU pipeline. I think one of the things you're going to see going forward, not just from the EU, we're going to see this in Canada as well, is the response to some of the Trump uncertainty is a real driver to make your own economy more competitive. And I think, you've already got France and certain elements in Germany talking about delaying some of the EU pipeline. My Growth Commission did a study on the effect of the UK joining CBAM, probably £700 cost GDP per capita in the UK. There's a whole range of the EU pipeline we should not be rushing to simply replicate because of the damaging effect it will have on UK GDP per capita. But the sort of core answer is single mind over all of these issues is really, really important. Because there are so many trade-offs and it's such a moving target at the moment.
Thank you very much. It'll be interesting whether the committee must investigate whether the creation of this Michael Ellum job does put somebody at the heart of the Cabinet Office who can look at trade policy across the board as well as the EU. But we shall hope to hear from him at some point. Lord Whitty, and again, welcome to you to the committee.
Yeah, in a sense, you started to answer my question, and what difference will the changes, more the location within the Cabinet Office make? And you've indicated it needs to go further. But are there any other changes that you devise in this area? My recollection years back is that, for example, in Norway there was a single point of dealing with the EU institutions. In Switzerland there was not. And Switzerland therefore had 100 or so treaties with the EU. But in addition, we've talked entirely about economic matters, whereas would you assume that there are changes within Whitehall and the focus in the Cabinet Office, which you want strengthened, also apply to, for example, areas such as the environmental agenda and the human rights agendas?
Thank you. Who'd like to start on that? Anton, you've passed, I think, on one or two.
Perhaps one additional comment to what has been said already is I think there's a real need to invest into resources in Brussels. I know it may seem a little bit counterintuitive in that the UK has obviously now left the European Union, but actually the job of influencing the EU from the outside is much, much harder than actually sitting in the room, and the resources you need to have. And this is actually one common denominator. If you look at the Norwegian mission and the Swiss mission and so on, in Brussels they have a lot of people, a lot of resources to be able to really influence the EU system effectively. And the other element of this is, of course, a lot of UK companies have European subsidiaries. They have channels of influencing the EU and EU legislation in much more effective ways than just the UK government minister making the same point to the counterpart in Brussels. So I think the government has to become much more sophisticated about how it engages with the EU system and really get very creative about doing that in practice.
Could I just come in on the back of that? When we were back in sort of 2017-18, beginning to think about post-Brexit arrangements for what was then the UK permanent representation, exactly the point that Anton has just made was top of our mind, and we came to the counterintuitive conclusion that the mission might need to be bigger and more extensive than it was at that time. What's happened since, of course, is the numbers in the mission are rather smaller than they used to be. I think that is very short-termist and is a bit of a known goal by the UK. We're going to have to strengthen that, and it requires different sort of skills. Actually trying to access the institutions from the outside. I think the civil service in that respect could learn a lot from industry, about how it seeks access in its lobbying efforts in the EU. So big change in thinking on that. I'm not sure how far that's advanced, but it should certainly be going a lot further. What Lord Whittier said about the sort of range of issues that you look at the centre, absolutely right. And this is why the Cabinet Office Nexus is so important, because essentially you're coordinating, you're not trying to do everything, you're coordinating across government. And it means that, that in those, as I say, the formal expression of that in the meetings as they used to be constructed, held by the Cabinet Office, you would have a revolving cast list of departments sat round the table to bring their wisdom to bear on the issue of the day. And it's not just about constructing your negotiating line on a single issue, it's about constructing your overarching negotiating approach. And that's really, given the interface between foreign and domestic issues that this entails when you're dealing with the EU, that's why the Cabinet Office Nexus was so important. No failing on the part of the Foreign Office, of course, but the Foreign Office coming into that, bringing its particular point of view to bear, and the Cabinet Office doing its role as the coordinating point in government. But just to reiterate the point, it requires the building up of that expertise, not just in the Cabinet Office, but across Whitehall, to ensure that the UK government gets the best service that it requires.
Thank you very much indeed. Baroness Nicholson.
Thank you very much indeed. As a point of entry into this complicated debate, I was most amused by the idea that Norway had a single identification for the EU. Presumably, that was the gentleman who picked the receiver up and said no. Where are the fish? But I did wonder, as a comment, when we're looking at whether or not the EU negotiations are helpful in our other negotiations, is there not a very constructive point here, which is that one of our very, very best Commission trade envoys was, of course, Peter Mendelsohn, who is now ambassador to North America, not Canada, I think, but certainly the Americas. No, not Canada.
It's working.
Well, he might be able to stop what's going on. And,
not yet, anyway.
Yes. Because, obviously, we have this difficult time of swinging between these vast continents who have huge trade strengths. And we're struggling at the moment today with how we're going to have a little reset with very, very modest ambitions, in my opinion, for the European Union, step by step, I hope. But also we have the USA with all sorts of excitements going on. And on top of that, we've got, I wonder, nobody's yet mentioned the trade strength in these issues of some of the Commonwealth countries. We merely refer to them as Australia or something, but in fact there is a lot of strength in there as well. Do our witnesses feel that where we've got any useful indicators as to how we can improve our negotiations in this astoundingly difficult time, when movement everywhere is very difficult indeed? We are closer to the USA than most other nations, in fact probably the closest of the lot. How are we going to expand that? Is there anything with the EU negotiations that will help us there? So I would very much like to hear these points elaborated by our rather exceptional witnesses.
Right, who's going to kick off on that? Shanker, perhaps. Could I turn in your direction?
Thank you. Yes, certainly. I think those are very good comments and questions. I think certainly on the point on the Commonwealth, the significant numbers of the CPTPP members are Commonwealth countries. I mean, obviously the big ones: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Malaysia. You've also got other countries that are in the accession line in the CPTPP. So that is an important strategic trade partnership that we have, and that the UK is part of as the first accession member of it. So I think we do cover ourselves somewhat there. I think there's more to be done with other Commonwealth countries, certainly. I think the UK is in an interesting position because we are one of the few, perhaps the only industrialized country that has, or that is in the frame for, shall we say, deals with the US, the EU, the CPTPP countries, etc. And that does provide an interesting opportunity for the UK. So I wouldn't be unduly concerned about the fact that the UK is not as large as some of these other countries or blocks that we've mentioned. There are many middle power countries that do very well as a result of those kinds of relationships. One thinks of countries like Chile and Singapore, New Zealand itself, who have been able to generate significant GDP per capita gains as a result of these relationships that they have, and I think there's no reason why the UK can't build on that. One area where I think we do, where there is going to be a much closer interest, much closer alignment between the US and the EU, and you're starting to see that already, is this economic security issue that Anton mentioned, and particularly with regard to our approach to China. I think in the interests of, if we can get the China, I say collectively, US, EU, and the UK, if we can get the approach to China right, I think it's a massive gain for global GDP per capita. If we get it wrong, it's going to be a significant wealth destruction effect. So how do we get it right with China? And I think there is a potential for an agreement here with the US, EU, and UK, which is, to essentially have a mechanism where if China is distorting its market for trade advantage in ways that damage competition, we have a robust mechanism to deal with that. But at the same time, send a signal that we welcome imports, we welcome China trade. We're not trying to tell them how to organize their economy, but we are saying that if they organize their economy in such a way that it damages competition in relevant markets, we have a robust mechanism to deal with that. I think that kind of approach would, certainly along the lines of some of the EU tools that have been developed, it's certainly along the lines of some of the US thinking, and I think that would be an area where we could very much work together and develop a closer overall approach.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much indeed. Anton,
I very much agree with Shanker. There should be a common objective guiding the US, the UK, and the EU in approaching economic issues from China. At the same time, if we look at the approach to date, I think there are strong indications that there is a growing divergence between those approaches. Just to take an example of tariffs on electric vehicles, if you look at the approaches of the US administration, the UK government, and the European Commission, they are very, very different. The UK government has not taken any action, even though the import rate of Chinese electric vehicles since 2020 to the UK has been actually higher than to the EU itself. And there are good reasons for that. It's a judgment call to prioritize consumers as opposed to producers. It is the result of the assessment the government has done on this issue, but there is a divergence between the positions that are being taken. Again, we can look at the question of export controls on critical technology. We've just seen a retaliation from Beijing on some of the biggest US technology companies in the last 24 hours, and the consequences of that. We haven't yet seen this done to some of the UK manufacturers. So I think the differences are starting to emerge, and I think it will be very difficult in practice to align these approaches, even though the benefits of that to the Western economic order would be enormous.
Thank you very much. Done on that one. Lord Stirrup.
Thanks very much, Lord Chair. The government has said it's committed to being as transparent and open as possible with Parliament on the issue of the reset. At the same time, it said it's not going to publish a reset policy paper. I mean, was it right to do so? Would such a document be a help or a hindrance in this kind of negotiation? But more widely, if I may, on the issue of transparency, since any negotiation is essentially a combination of wins and losses, what Parliament would be particularly interested in, and I suspect the public more widely, is what the overall balance sheet looks like, whether it's overall in credit for the UK or in debit. So would it not be a good thing to have some sort of mechanism to assess the outcome of any negotiations and to provide some kind of independent analysis of the costs and gains. For example, the likely economic gains from anything that's achieved in the negotiation, because that would aid transparency in that it would help Parliament and the public assess whether the concessions that have been made in the negotiation were worth what we got. But also, of course, the fact that such an assessment was going to be made might help to concentrate the minds of those who are doing the negotiation. What does the team think?
Should I make a...
Would you like to start on that?
Start on that one. Yes, what you're talking about, I think it's called impact assessment, which is, of course, a tool that government should use for all policy development. In order to illustrate to Parliament and to the public what the costs and benefits of that policy might be. And indeed, back in the day, in 2018, the department for which I was responsible produced with our colleagues in the Treasury an impact assessment on the various possible outcomes of Brexit, all of which demonstrated from an EEA type deal to something like what we got through to no deal, that in the terms of that assessment, much disputed, of course, and controversial, but all of those outcomes would have ultimately been negative for the long-term prosperity of the United Kingdom. It was interesting, of course, that such an impact assessment wasn't done for the TCA itself, to memory, though Lord Frost will correct me if I'm wrong on that. And it is important that the government is clear on what its negotiating objectives are. I think there is a tendency in the UK to think that you have to hide all your negotiation objectives. The EU, by contrast, is a sort of more open book on what its negotiation approach is. And I think that is an interesting contrast. We have something to learn from the EU on that score. So more clarity on what the negotiation objectives are, and not least so that they can then be properly assessed. The problem I think we have now with the way that these negotiations will move forward is that they will be rather more piecemeal than the big set piece you get with something like the TCA. So it's unlikely. There will be some significant moments where two or three things land together. But if you take the argument that I think all three of us have been making in the course of the afternoon, that this will be a negotiation which will be continuous negotiation where the objectives need to extend over time, you're never going to get to one point where you say, there it's done and dusted and there is your overall impact assessment. The risk for the government then is it sort of gets slightly caught on what are perceived as the concessions it's made, and it has difficulty defending those. So ultimately, the government has to take its courage in its hands on this. It has to be clear about its objectives, honest in the cost benefits of those objectives, and setting that out clearly as it sets off into negotiations, and then doing the rigorous impact assessments afterwards. I would absolutely advise that that's how the government should approach it. Whether it will or not remains to be seen.
Anton, please.
I was slightly different here from Philip in that I actually think it was the right decision not to publish anything to date. And the reason for that is that it would have been a very easy excuse for the European Commission to refute a lot of the objectives and the means that the government may have suggested for pursuing those objectives. It's a very easy argument for the Commission to say that it doesn't stack up to the full freedoms, to the integrity of the single market and so on. So I think it was, tactically speaking, it was the right decision not to do that now. But I also think that, and this takes me back to my initial point, we now have a window of opportunity up until the political summit on the 19th of May. And I do think, as I suggested in my recent paper, that what the UK government and the European Commission should be working towards is some sort of renewed political declaration that would set out a set of shared objectives and a shared roadmap for pursuing those objectives in the next 12 to 18 months. And then I think that would be the right time to consult businesses on those objectives and the civil society and all the other stakeholders, and to have a public debate with experts about what are the right means and the policy instruments for meeting some of those targets. And I do think that a shared document would be a way of building a bit of consensus and shared understanding between the two sides on what they actually want to negotiate. I think there are some different ideas at the moment, and building as much of that shared understanding as possible would be the right step forward. So if that was the outcome of the council of the summit meeting, I think that would be a very good one in my view.
All of which suggests, and I think I would agree personally, that this May meeting is really the launch of the more detailed phase, and this is going to be several years before one gets to any clear outcomes. I think there's a risk that the summit can be seen as the end point, as some sort of moment of great declaration of a triumphant outcome. It's clearly not going to be that, is it? It's going to be the start, the kick-off event for a long and complex process.
Yes, I do agree with that, but also there is a debate happening in Brussels at the moment between the member states on what kind of approach, procedurally speaking, is the right one. Should the EU take a package-based approach where nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which is a very common refrain from the last couple of years, no doubt very familiar to people in the room, or should it take a more incremental step-by-step approach? There's difference of views between member states. And I do think actually a package approach in many ways would be beneficial to some of the UK's interests in expediting a lot of the difficult issues, because the deadlines on a number of questions that are part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, mostly the fisheries question, which expires at the end of June 2026, would help expedite quite a lot of the other tricky issues. So I do think there is some merit in that more incremental approach where we are just waiting for the outcome of individual negotiations that are somehow added onto the TCA in phases or done in other legal means could mean that we would be negotiating on all of this for the next 5, 6, 7 years, however long. So we'll see where this debate lands in Brussels, but I think it's an important one to watch for the UK government.
Thank you very much. We've talked about influencing the EU, so I'm going to pass straight on to a last question for Baroness Hayter.
Thank you. Had 4th of July not happened, we would presumably, I don't know what we'd be doing inquiring now, but shortly we would move on to what should be in the review of the TCA. So I'm quite interested whether there's, other than the reset, we've covered a lot of area, are there other things that we mustn't forget that would have been on our agenda for the, it's not actually called a review, is it?
Yeah, a TCA review.
It is called the review of the TCA. And there may be areas like consumer policy or the way the TCA has set up its own institutions. Are there things that we just want to have in the back of our mind that we shouldn't forget because of the reset?
Maybe I can have a crack at that one. I think there may be a slight difference in approach on the TCA reset between the UK and the European Union, the European Commission. I think the Commission regards the TCA reset very much as, how is the TCA working? And where there is compliance, where there are compliance issues, how is it being complied with before you go on to the next stage of figuring out, well, is if you're going to change it, how are you going to change it? Whereas I think the UK government is much more focused on, what are the changes that we can have. I think because of the announced reset, that announced reset is sort of now subsuming that process, because I think, Chairman, you're right that this May is going to be the start of a whole set of processes and discussions that will go through the TCA review and incorporate the TCA review. And I think to that end, I think it's totally appropriate for governments to set out their negotiating objectives in broad terms, and that's what I think the UK should do. But the specifics of the negotiations, I think it is inevitable that because there are wins and losses, as you've noted, it's important that much as members of Parliament have a very important function to play in approving any package that comes back, the Commission, any other country, is not going to want to negotiate, with individual members of Parliament. So, or indeed individual members of Congress in the US. So, having a package that is submitted for a sort of up or down vote, as it were, is probably a better way to go. I think if I can just sound a note of caution about, I'm fully supportive of impact assessments and so forth. I've written extensively about them, but just a note of caution on the, and I say this as someone who spent 30 years doing, developing economic models, the limitations of economic modeling. Economic modeling will not tell you the impact of dynamic effects of regulatory reform, of business confidence, of all of these things. Economic models frequently underestimate the effects of trade deals. And I can give you lots of examples of this. That doesn't mean we don't do them. I think it's very important to do them, but we can't unduly fetishize sort of economic models and just say, well, this is the laptop tells me this, therefore we must do this. Ultimately, it is governments and ultimately trade policy, whether it's the EU, reset EU negotiations, or indeed everything we do with the US and China. This is part of a global, trade strategy. And ultimately the government has to be responsible, for that. I think equally, it's important not to simply think that your policy or your commercial policy is the aggregation of what businesses tell you they want. I mean, governments have to think about incumbents, they have to think about new businesses, new entrants, businesses of the future, consumers. There's a whole range of things that governments have to think about. So, we have to be careful about how we use those kinds of sort of raw inputs in the overall negotiation of these things.
Thank you very much indeed. That feels to me like a very good way of rounding off a very complex and useful discussion. Unless any other members of the committee have anything that they would particularly like to come back on or raise as a final comment. If not, then I think on behalf of all of us, can I say very, very warm thank you to all three of you. Really interesting, enlightening session, certainly for me. I've learned a lot and very helpful in terms of framing our report. So many, many thanks. And I'm going to declare the public part of our meeting over. Thank you.